Welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about something called the Trompenaars Cultural Dimensions Framework. And you might see some overlap between Trompenaars Cultural Dimensions and Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, which we discussed also in this week's content. There is overlap, but there are also some pretty notable differences, and so that's why I think it's important and worthwhile to spend a little bit of time talking about this different way of approaching cultural dimensions. So, Franz Trompenaars is mostly known in the business world. He and another man named Charles Hampton Turner developed this model to help managers and professionals better understand and manage cultural differences for business and communication purposes. The focus of Trompenaars' cultural dimensions is to see how people in different cultures interact with each other and with their environment, not just communication, but also with the world around them. So some of the cultural differences are discussed here similarly to Hofstede's. However, there's no judgment basis for these, right? So these are not saying that one particular dimension is better or worse than the others. They're just different ways of solving universal problems. So as we go through these different dimensions, and there are 7 for Trompenaars, you'll see that there's not a judgment made about whether one way or another is good or better, but it's just a way of trying to understand how other cultures might approach these things. On your screen, you see the 7 dimensions that make up Trompenaars' framework. So we'll look at those each and maybe try to apply how they might play out in the real world. So the first category is universalism versus particularism. And this is whether a culture is based on rules and standards or relationships and trust. The next category, individualism versus collectivism. This is whether a culture focuses more on the group or the individual. And you see a lot of crossover here or overlap with Hofstede's dimension. The next category is neutral versus affective. Whether the person within a culture expresses one's emotions openly or not. So in a neutral culture, people are less likely to express emotions openly, whereas in an affective culture, people are more likely to express emotions openly. The next category is specific versus diffuse. This is whether the public and private life are closely linked or not. One example of this is whether or not you have close, tight connections with coworkers, or whether you kind of have these separate lives. Your public life that is your, friendships and relationships at work, and a private life that is sort of detached. Achievement versus ascription is the next category. This is whether a culture rewards according to one's performance or to one's age, status, or gender. So some cultures are more achievement driven, whereas others are more status driven. The next category is the category of time. Some cultures tend to value or see time in a sequential way, and others see time in a more synchronous way. This is a kind of a judgment of whether people tend to do one thing at a time or several things at once. And then the final category is inner directed versus outer directed. To what extent do we control our environment, or does our environment control us? And another way of thinking of this is, are we in control of our own lives? Are we in control of our own destiny? Or is the environment around us, the world around us, imposing its will upon us, and we're somewhat beholden or victims of our circumstances? Let's take a closer look at these different categories. First up, what's most important, the rule of law or the rule of context? This is a sort of a spectrum between universalism and particularism. societies and cultures that are more universalist in nature tend to see laws and rules as a set universal truth, something that's unchanging. And it applies universally, meaning everyone should adhere to these particular rules and laws at all times. So it doesn't matter what your status is, it doesn't matter what the context is. What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. It's kind of a black and white way of looking at the world. Particularism, on the other hand, looks at context, looks at relationship, and decides whether right and wrong are based on this particular set of circumstances and priorities. Something that might be wrong in one circumstance is not necessarily wrong in another circumstance. You have to consider a lot of different factors. I thought about this recently as I heard about a story of a teacher in the Kansas City area who was fired for picking up a student in the hallway who was having a kind of emotional meltdown. And the teacher saw that this student having an emotional meltdown in the hallway was causing kind of a scene, and feeling bad for the student, feeling like maybe that student wouldn't benefit socially from having all of the student's peers kind of seeing this moment of crisis. The teacher scooped up the student, pulled them into a classroom, and tried to offer some comfort out of the view of classmates. Well, that school district has a very strict policy about physical touch between teachers and students, and the school district decided that teacher had broken that policy, and they released her, or they, I guess, fired her or suspended her from her job as a teacher. Now, this teacher was quite popular, and the community rallied in support of the teacher, saying, this teacher was clearly not in violation of the policy, or at least not the spirit of the policy. The spirit of the policy was to protect students, and that's exactly what the teacher was trying to do. So it wasn't a matter of a teacher, touching a student and harming the student, but rather a teacher touching the student and helping the student. And so this, I think, is a great example of how in a universalist kind of system, rules are applied broadly, regardless of context, regardless of what the circumstances might be. And sometimes that feels really unfair, right? But there are societies and cultures that lean that way more so. I would say the United States actually is probably more on the universal side of things, whereas there's other cultures where that are more particular in that they look at all the circumstances, and in a more particular culture, they might view that situation with the teacher and decide that it's perfectly okay in that circumstance for the teacher to touch the student because they were offering help, not harming the student. So there's these two ends of the spectrum. In one case, the rule of law is supreme, and it's unchanging regardless of your status or the situation. On the other end of the spectrum, there's sort of a give and take, a flexibility to what is right and wrong based on the circumstances. The next category is related to emotion. Neutral cultures versus emotional cultures. So this is again, on a spectrum. Of course, all humans have emotions, but in different cultures, there are certain times when it's appropriate to express emotion and other times when it's inappropriate to express emotion. And in some cultures, it's almost never appropriate to express emotion, whereas in other cultures, it's almost always appropriate to express emotions. So I think of an example from when shortly after my wife and I had our first child. My wife is from the Philippines. Her mother came to visit us, and so it had been a couple of years since my wife saw her mother, And I remember going to the airport to pick up her mom whenever she arrived, and I was imagining sort of the reunion scenes that we think of at airports, the way that I would maybe greet my parents if I had not seen them for a couple of years. So I expected, lots of hugs, lots of maybe tears, lots of kind of celebrating in the moment of being reunited. Well, when my wife's mother arrived, we saw her come off of the or come out of the security line at the airport, and I walked towards her, ready to kind of give her a hug and welcome her. My wife, on the other hand, walked over, relatively casually, said hello, and was, of course, smiled and was very happy to see her mother. But there wasn't a lot of hugging or celebrating or tears like I would expect, right? And that's just because I come from a culture here in the U.S. where we are more emotional at least in some public settings. Not to the extent that other cultures are. I mean, we're on the spectrum, but we tend towards the more emotional. Whereas my wife is from a culture where people tend to be more neutral, less likely to express big emotions in a public setting. The next category is the specific versus the diffuse. And this is really related to how much space exists between your private and your public life. In certain cultures, people tend to draw thick lines between their public life, their work life, how they behave and socialize with people, or they typically don't socialize with people a whole lot outside of the workplace. And then that contrasts with cultures that are more diffuse. A culture like Germany, for example, tends to be more specific, and that means that people have, they have a work life. They have their colleagues that they work with side by side. They see them every day. But as soon as the day is finished, most people would go home and they have a completely separate life away from work. They maybe don't really socialize with the people that they spend their days working with. Everything kind of fits into these neat different categories, right? And I would say the USA is maybe kind of like this. I mean, it depends maybe on personality in some cases, but I think most people sort of separate the personal social life with their work life. Not always true, but often the case. In more diffuse cultures, you have people who really don't distinguish much between their personal life and their private life. In fact, the two just kind of blend together seamlessly. They might socialize on the evenings or weekends with coworkers. They see their coworkers maybe as some of their most important relationships, right? And they don't have maybe outside of family, they don't have a lot of friendships necessarily that aren't people that they work closely with. So this would be a culture more like China, where people tend to develop strong bonds with those that they work with. There's not a distinction between the two. So just another difference between certain cultures. Again, I would say that I think the USA falls more on the specific side of this spectrum, but you might have a different idea. The next category is achievement versus ascription. Do others bestow honor on you because of who you are or because of what you've done? So in the United States, we tend to be more achievement based. And what that means is that the people that we look up to the most, the people that receive the most honor in society and in American culture at least, tend to have accomplished great things. They are pro athletes who are, have won lots of competitions and have proven that they're great, right? Or they are, politicians that have won elections, or they are business owners who've grown these massive corporations, and so on. So we tend to honor people who have had great achievement, whereas in cultures where that are more ascription based, they tend to honor people based on who that person is. Um, for example, some countries still have royalty, right? The UK still has royalty. They still have dukes and earls, and these are people that haven't necessarily achieved a whole lot, or haven't necessarily don't 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 have achievements that they can point to as the source of their fame, right? They essentially had this kind of the lives that they have that are maybe very wealthy, influential. It was kind of bestowed on them, right? So there's kind of a lineage that can be traced, and they were born into the right family, essentially, right? And this is what we mean when we talk about ascription versus achievement. Ascription, it's when honor is ascribed to you based on who you are, not necessarily what you've done or what you've accomplished. Societies that have a high value on ascription, that practice ascription, might honor people because they're old, right? If you live a long life, you receive honor in a lot of cultures. It's not so much the case in the United States. We don't necessarily respect old people. We kind of, unfortunately, spend more time probably mocking them or just sort of ignoring them, right? But yeah, ascription, it's based on who you are. Achievement based on what you've done, what you've accomplished. The next category is time related. We have sequential time versus synchronous time. And cultures that are more sequential in their view of time think of time as something that is a limited commodity. It's something that can run out. It's something that you can waste. In fact, in countries like America, where we are very sequential in our view of time, we talk about time as money. We even say time is money. We talk about how we need to buy more time. We don't want to waste time. And so we think about time as a resource that can run out. And so we try to manage it very strictly, right? In cultures that are more synchronous in their view of time, time is not necessarily seen as a resource. They don't view it as something that's limited or that might run out. They see it as just a way. They really don't think about it a whole lot. They allow their lives to just focus on the task at hand. If it takes a long time, it's okay. They don't measure time in the same ways that maybe a more sequentially timed culture would. So it doesn't mean, again, reminder, we're talking about a spectrum here. We're talking about generalizations, but yeah, there's just certainly cultures, and maybe you've spent time with cultures where time is not prioritized as much as it is in places like Germany and the U.S., where we have a very sequential view of it, and we treat it as a limited resource. This last category is the question of, or the spectrum of internal direction or outer direction. And what this means is, do you see the environment you're in as something that you can shape, or is it something that shapes you? So in cultures where people are more internally directed, there tends to be a view that as individuals or potentially as groups, we have the ability to shape the world around us, to change things that are broken, to fix bad systems, to improve the world around us, our lives around us, or to just make ourselves better, right? And we kind of feel ourselves shaping the reality of the world. And this is very much a Western kind of mindset. Here in America, we tell young people that they should try to change the world. If you see a problem, try to change it. And that is a more internalized direction, the belief that we determine who we are. Cultures that are more outer directed believe that the environment that they are born into has a great force and a great deal to say about who they become. So they see the circumstances of their birth as the primary shaper of who they become. So they might not feel as much ability to change the world or to change their circumstances or to improve a bad situation, because from their perspective, the deck is stacked, right? I'm not saying that this is necessarily the same as a victim mentality. I don't think they're the same. But what I mean is that they see themselves as maybe a smaller piece of their world perspective or their outlook, and they don't necessarily believe that they have the ability, as an individual or as a group, to affect change on a large scale, right? So they would say that the choices that they make are in large part shaped by the circumstances or the environment that they live in. And again, it's a spectrum. So people within a culture might be countercultural, right? They might not have the exact same perspective as those around them, but these are just generalizations. But yeah, you have the internal and the outer direction. I would imagine that if we wanted to compare and contrast different cultures, in the West, we do find ourselves to be a bit more internally directed, whereas in East Asian cultures, we see more outer direction, where people are shaped by their families, by their births, by their many other outer factors rather than their own internal direction. So those are Trompenaars' 7 cultural dimensions. Sometimes you might find them online as Trompenaars Turner or Trompenaars Hampton Turner, because these cultural dimensions have been refined and crafted alongside a man named Charles Hampton Turner. So sometimes you'll find it listed that way, but they are, as I mentioned, similar to Hofstede's dimensions, but enough difference that I think it's important to take a close look at both of them. So hope you got something out of this, and I appreciate the time you get into this video.